We want to welcome our viewers in Korea and around the world. I'm Moon Gun-young. You're watching Arirang News special coverage of the 2020 general election. We're counting down to the first real results in this battle for seats in Korea's 21st National Assembly. The spotlight has now shifted from the polling stations to ballot counting centers. According to Korean broadcaster KBS, as of 11:40 p.m., of the 253 constituent seats up for grabs, the ruling Democratic Party is likely to win 153 seats, the main opposition United Future Party 95 and Independents 5. Our election team is covering all of the action at key posts, but first, let's get a breakdown of the results so far. Live in the studio with me, to my left, our political correspondent Kim Mo-geun, and to my right, Professor An Jun-sung, visiting professor at Yonsei University Graduate School of International Studies. Great to have you both.
Thank you.
Now, first of all, Mo-geun, the results so far suggest a win for the ruling party bloc. Give us a rundown.
Well, as of 11:30 p.m., more than 60% of the votes have been counted. We still have to wait and see until the final results come in. But looking at the current ballots, local media suggests that the ruling Democratic Party could take at least 153 seats to take the lead, while the main opposition Future Korea Party would take 95 seats, while the independent candidates take 5 seats. Compared to the results of the exit polls announced a little past 6 p.m., the latest results are better looking for the ruling party. And to give you an overview of the exit polls, more than half of the 300 seats are colored in blue, which represents the Democratic Party and its satellite party. A poll conducted by KBS, the ruling DP and the satellite Civil Together Party could grasp up to 175 seats, while the main opposition United Future Party and the Future Korea Party will finish in second with a maximum of 134 seats. And as for the highly symbolic Jongno, where key political heavyweights are elected in South Korean history, 90% of the votes have been counted, and the ballots show a clear victory for ruling Democratic Party candidate Lee Na-kyun with at least 57% of the votes. Let's take a listen at what he has to say following the results.
I feel a great sense of responsibility. The citizens have given the ruling party the responsibility to deal with the global crisis and overcome national disaster brought about by COVID-19. I would like to thank the Jongno-gu residents for giving me the opportunity to serve them. I will do my best to fulfill the responsibilities as lawmaker and in the district.
And his counterpart, Hwang Kyo-an from the main opposition Future Korea Party announced that he would take all responsibility for his party's results and vowed to leave his post as the chief of the party. Much attention has been focused especially on this district as both candidates have served as prime ministers, and the winner of the district has been widely considered to have a higher chance to presidency.
Right, it was a district that was really highly observed. Now, Professor Ahn, based on the results so far, it looks like the South Korean citizens have handed President Moon and his ruling party a more than a passing grade as a midterm progress report, I suppose.
Yeah, sure. Actually, I kind of anticipated it's kind of their victory for his party and the Democratic Party also, but I think it's a much bigger victory than I expected. And I would say that it's much more than passing grade. Maybe we're still assuming that C is a passing grade range. I would say B range, maybe between B and B plus, depends on what happened. And plus, and we have to wait and see actually what really happened, because the last general election, 2016, there was great discrepancy between the exit poll result and the actual result. So we have to wait and see, and by maybe 2 a.m. this morning maybe, so we'll see what happens.
Right, in about 2 hours at least time. Mo-geun, the ruling party, however, had initially hoped to secure 180 seats, eager to strengthen its position in parliament. Of course, 180 would be the 3/5 of the seats needed before bills could pass, be introduced and passed in the assembly. That may not be feasible at this point. How did the two largest parties react initially to the early exit polls?
Well, from the early hours today, rival parties have set up situation rooms in the National Assembly, and they've been watching how the voter turnout had been released throughout the day. And like you said, initially the two parties aimed to grasp at least 130 seats to take a majority of the local district seats. But the ruling party was at a celebratory mood. But the leadership of both parties said that nothing is sure until the final votes have been counted, and vowed to continue to do their best until the very last minute. Other minor parties also seem to be disappointed since the exit polls show little change for the 20th National Assembly.
Right, right. As we gradually get a clearer picture of the candidates who have been able to win over voters, it's turning out to be a long night for election workers who have been focused on the all-important task of counting ballots. Our Kim Da-mi joins us live from one of the counting centers in Seoul. Now, tell me, roughly 3 hours into voting counting, how far along are we?
Hi, Kanyang. As you can see right behind me, people are still diligently counting the votes. In the last general election in 2016, it took around 8 hours to get the final results, but this year it's going to take longer. Here's what we have so far. As for the ballot count across the nation as of 11 p.m., it stood at 52.2%. Breaking it down by the major regions of South Korea, in Seoul, we stood at 38.3%. In Gyeonggi-do province, 53.7%. In Busan, 46.8%. And Daegu at 43.4%. Hopefully, we should be able to see some results taking shape by around 2 a.m. In fact, the National Election Commission predicts that for single-member districts, vote counting will end around 4 a.m. But for the proportional representation seats, counting will go on until 8 a.m. and the final results will be announced on Thursday afternoon. This is because while the district ballots are counted by machine, the PR ballots this year are too long for the machines, so they have to be counted by hand. They're so long because this year there are 35 parties, which is a record number. Across the country, there are around 64,000 vote counters, an increase of 35% from the last election. On top of the need for a manual vote counting, things are different this time because of the COVID-19 crisis. All the vote counters are wearing masks and gloves while keeping an appropriate distance from one another. The top priorities this election are sanitation and safety, so the counting stations are ventilated on a regular basis. And any volunteer who feels unwell will leave the facility immediately. For real-time updates, the National Election Commission is also providing the count online. That's all from me, Kanyang.
All right, our Kim Da-mi from one of the voting centers in Seoul. Thank you. Or vote counting centers, I should correct myself. Now, fears of the coronavirus pandemic did not keep large numbers of South Koreans from heading to the polls to vote in the national parliamentary elections. Voter turnout reached a whopping 66.2% of the country's 44 million eligible voters, the highest turnout of any national election since 1992. Our Lee Kyung-eun is at the National Election Commission.
As of 8 p.m., the estimated voter turnout rate is 66.2%. That is the highest figure for a general election since 1992. It's also 8.2 percentage points higher than the final turnout from the previous general election 4 years ago. In the 6 previous elections, only twice has the country seen a turnout of over 60%. Such a high turnout is mainly attributed to last week's early voting, which reached a record high turnout of 26.7%. Breaking it down by region, the city of Ulsan has seen the highest rate with 68.6%. The capital Seoul is in third with 68.1%. The lowest so far is Chungcheongnam-do province. Much attention was on the southeastern city of Daegu, the city hardest hit by the COVID-19 outbreak. In the last general election, its voter turnout was the country's lowest, but this year it's among the top 10. In fact, the city clinched the top spot briefly this morning. It seems like COVID-19 has drawn people closer to politics, not away from it. The NEC is taking a little longer than usual to announce the final turnout because the polls were open later for voters who are quarantined. Lee Kyung-eun, Arirang News.
The 2020 general election was unlike any other. Various measures were taken to allow this election to take place as scheduled during the COVID-19 pandemic. It turns out more than 29.1 million of the 44 million eligible voters cast their ballot this election, even those in self-quarantine for the coronavirus. Polls nationwide close at 7 p.m. Korea time to allow those in self-quarantine for COVID-19 to cast their ballots after hours. This is how they did it. Our Kim Jae-hee reports.
Voters wearing face masks, getting their temperatures checked, and disinfecting their hands. After putting on plastic gloves, they patiently wait in line, standing at least 1 meter apart from one another. This is how South Korea's 2020 general election was carried out on April 15th due to the global coronavirus pandemic.
It's my first time voting like this, but I feel clean. I think a lot of people like it this way, and I hope they continue to do it like this.
I think it's a good idea to carry on with the election. It looks like everything is going well as people are wearing masks, gloves, and keeping the right distance from each other.
Those in self-quarantine were not forgotten. The government came up with a separate voting timeline for them, 6 to 7 p.m., after all other voters were finished. For this, the quarantine restrictions were temporarily lifted from 5:20 p.m. to 7 p.m. But only those who had applied prior to the election were allowed to vote. According to South Korea's Ministry of the Interior and Safety, around 23% of all those in self-quarantine, over 13,000 people, had applied. Self-quarantined voters like those at this polling station in Seoul's Central Jongno-gu district, deemed crucial in terms of its political importance, were accompanied by health officials in full protective gear. They were checked for any signs of the virus, such as cough or fever, prior to them casting their vote. They also used a separate voting booth set up outside the building as a precautionary measure, and the booths were disinfected thoroughly after use. Kim Jae-hee, Arirang News.
Now, despite the physical distancing, despite the COVID-19 pandemic, not only did South Korea manage to push ahead with this election, but a 28-year high voter turnout of a whopping 66.2%. Professor Ahn, what can we attribute this record high voter turnout to?
I think there's two major things. First is about the COVID-19 factor, and it was supposed to be played negatively on the approval rate for President Moon and his party, but however it turned out to be the other way around because that his administration handled it very well. I mean, compared to other nations, right? So he got approval from the publics. I think that's good news. Also, there's about the increasing popularity about the early voting, because about 26.7% of the turnout, is about 40% of the actual polling is the early vote, right?
Right.
So that would be a factor. But the problem with that early vote is that it's not counted as it's not counted into the exit poll. So we have to see about could be some other factors, in the final moment.
Right, that could be a deciding factor in the results. Now, Morgan, fears of the coronavirus are resetting political calendars all across the globe, but that's of course not the case for the Korean elections. However, it did have an impact on the overseas voters.
Yes, Kanyang, from late March, the National Election Commission has canceled overseas voting in more than 65 diplomatic missions in 40 countries for the first time since the system was first introduced in 2012. This meant only half of the nearly 172,000 eligible voters were able to cast their ballots. Koreans in the U.S., the UK, France, Italy, and many other European countries were unable to vote. Following continuing concerns over the turnout and the citizens' right to vote, the Commission and health authorities announced that COVID-19 patients in South Korea who pre-registered last month can send their ballots from where they are quarantined through mail. And just a few days ago, the Ministry of Health and Welfare laid out new measures to allow more people to vote by temporarily lifting quarantine hours for asymptomatic people who are in self-quarantine for possible COVID-19 infections. They've been allowed to leave their homes from 5:20 p.m. and finish their votes and return home by 7.
Right, so and the voting closed at 7 p.m., which is an hour late. Now, Morgan, what are some other factors that were different about this year's elections?
Well, as many of you already know, this election comes at a sensitive time when the nation is in the midst of fighting the coronavirus outbreak. So alongside local voters, other countries are also paying a lot of attention. Though many countries such as Britain, France, and Chile decided to postpone their respective elections to prevent the possibility of the spread of COVID-19, South Korea has become the first country to hold such a large-scale election during the pandemic. And as part of efforts to prevent the spread of the virus, the National Election Commission has implemented various measures, such as making voters wear masks and gloves and making them stay at least a meter away from each other. And due to this, much attention is focused on today's election, not only from local observers, but also from across the globe. Some foreign media even describe South Korea as Asia's beacon of democracy.
Right, and the rest of the world are keeping a close eye on South Korea as it becomes the first in the world to head to the polls in the COVID-19 era. Global media say this country could set a role model for how to hold a major election at the height of the COVID-19 crisis. Here's our Yoon Jung-min.
South Korea's 2020 general election has been in the global media's spotlight. The BBC has elaborated on how voters in South Korea have kept at least 1 meter between each other at polling stations and how election workers have checked temperatures and disinfected about 14,000 voting stations. The BBC added that most people seem to be happy to put up with the short delay for the sake of democracy. Bloomberg reported Wednesday that South Korea holding the largest election since the start of the coronavirus pandemic might spur other world leaders with good poll numbers to follow suit. It went on to say that the decision contrasted with some U.S. states which have delayed presidential primaries. Italy's daily newspaper La Stampa also highlighted South Korea's general election on Tuesday local time, saying that the country has not given up the election despite the COVID-19 pandemic. It added that the country's approach could be a model on how to hold elections during the crisis. Other foreign press, including Al Jazeera, Time magazine, and The Telegraph, all also reported on the election. According to CNN this week, dozens of countries, including Sri Lanka, the UK, and France, have decided to postpone elections due to the pandemic. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News.
So South Korea became the first country in the world to hold a nationwide election in this COVID-19 pandemic era. What are the implications here?
Yeah, I think that they're sending a very strong message, clear message to the world. And it's like the pandemic crisis can be opportunities on political leaders. And I think it really depends. The question depends on the degree of public trust, about the government, how much you trust it.
Sure.
And throughout the pandemic, the crisis management, have shown by the Korean government, I think the general public has, they kind of built on their public trust on the government, the handling of a situation. I think that's the issue. It's not the issue about whether you should postpone the election or not. It's more important whether the government can obtain the public trust.
Enough trust to go ahead with such a massive event of such kind. Now, Morgan, another point to note is that the electoral bill has been revised last year, which led to many firsts this election season.
Well, with the passage of the bill late last December, for the first time in history, the legal voting age in South Korea has been changed from 19 to 18. And with this, some 548,000 additional voters, mostly high school students, have been able to cast their ballots in this election. Also, the way in which the 47 proportional representation seats are distributed have changed. A 50% mixed member proportional representation system has been introduced with aims to diversify Korea's National Assembly, which has been dominated by the two largest parties. Well, it's a bit complicated, but just to give you a recap, the previous system reflected a party's voter turnout in relation to the 47 PR seats. But with the new system, only 17 out of the 47 seats will follow the existing system, and the remaining 30 seats will be distributed by taking the percentage of the PR votes won, then subtracting the number of local seats won, and that remaining number is then divided by 2. This new system prompted the larger parties to create the so-called satellite parties and only put forward candidates for the PR seats, allowing them to grab even more seats in the National Assembly. It also led the launch of other parties so that the total of 35 parties competed for the PR seats this time, making this year's ballot paper more than 48 centimeters long, the longest proportional representation ballot in Korean history.
Right, the longest ballot paper and the most complicated system I've ever seen so far. Now, Professor Ahn, are there key questions or factors that you're looking at as an indicator of how things will unfold throughout tonight or the early morning hours of tomorrow?
I think the
today, I should say.
Big issue is that whether, we estimate that about 153 seats will be go for Democratic Party, but we have to see how many seats they actually get in last. But assuming that they will get, that's true, if they get outright majority on National Assembly, that means that it will provide President Moon had a great booster for him to push forward his political agenda, such as the judicial reform. So the question is that whether the Democratic Party can get outright majority. or if not, they have to get ally with other, satellite or other parties, right? That's the issues.
Now, how will tonight's result impact the country's state of affairs post-general election?
Yeah, I think that I have a concern because it's a great news for the President Moon's party, and his, supporters. But however, if you look at a big picture, it's an increasing degree of political polarization in Korean Peninsula, like East versus West. So you see that the political map, is very serious about red and blue and red, very
the regional
contrast.
divide.
Yeah, that's very concerning because I think that one of the reasons we have a recent amendment to the election law was try to get, decrease the impact, the level of the bi-party control, two major party controlling, but it didn't turn out, and then the big parties using satellite create a satellite party, which kind of bypass that political system. So I think that's kind of a concern as a big picture. I think that's things we have to talk about after the election.
Initially, that system was introduced to give more of the smaller parties more seats in the assembly, but that didn't turn out too well, did it?
Actually, I was surprised. I went to the voting today, and there's about number 37, right, the parties, but excluding the first two parties. So they didn't actually put their candidate for proportional the candidate, right? So what happened was that they have 37, right? So it's very confusing. But still, because that under the current new system, right, if you have kind of a certain number, greater number of the local constituent victory, we will decrease total number of your seat in the congressional seats. So that's why they come using, getting smarter. Or we can, bypass system, create a satellite, party, so that we can get both winning situation.
Well, thanks to the system, Mo-Kyeon, the ballot papers for the PR seats, they have to be hand counted now, and that's why we're expecting the results to come out much later than previous elections. When do we expect them?
Well, the National Election Commission says the outline of which party would get the local seats, how many seats will a party win, will be out at 2 a.m. But the vote count is expected to be completed by 4 a.m. on Thursday. Counting for votes for the proportional representation seats will likely be finished by 8 a.m. due to the extraordinarily long ballot paper. The final results of the distribution of PR seats will take even longer to be released because of the new calculation method based on the new proportional representation system. The final results are expected to be announced on Thursday afternoon.
So we'll get those results then. Now, Professor Ahn, I'd like your impression of this entire election results for today.
Well, as I explained earlier today, I was kind of expecting a victory for the Democratic Party. But I think it's bigger victory than I expected. But we're still counting, right? We have to wait and see what happened. But I think that we'll give, another opportunity for President Moon to push forward with his, initiative. I think that's the good news because that he has some hard time with the National Assembly approval. the endorsement about many agendas. So I guess that's great news for the President Moon. But I hope we can come together to, improve the system, the way the election system in the future.
Well, still a bit too early to tell as there are hotly contested areas, but we'll wait and see how the results flow in. Thank you, Mo-Kyeon, our political correspondent, for this wonderful election night coverage, and An Jin-sung, visiting professor at Yonsei University Graduate School of International Studies. Thank you so much.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.
오늘 투표장에 갔었을 때 예전하고 좀 사뭇 느낌이 달랐어요. 왜냐면 1m 거리 두기를 하고 있었기 때문에 그 부분도 새로웠고
이 지역에서 좀 더 이 지역 발전을 도모할 수 있는 그런 지역 후보를 뽑아야겠다라고 생각을 하고 투표를 했고요.
위기 국면을 돌파할 수 있는 좀 튼튼한 정책들이 마련되어야 하고 그리고 일관성 있는 정치가 진행이 되어서 좀 똘똘 뭉쳐서 헤쳐나갈 수 있도록 그렇게 체력이 길러지면 좋겠다는 그런 생각을 했습니다. 네.
국민의 통합을 해야 되겠고 특히나 이 정치하는 분들은 정쟁을 좀 없애고 국회에 들어와서 정을 논의하는 그런 정치인이 돼야지.
그냥 한 표 한 표 이렇게 계속 투표를 올리고 투표권으로서 이렇게 시민들이 계속 이렇게 정치를 주목하고 있다 그냥 그런 거를 좀 기대를.
일단 아이들이 원래 처음 투표하는 해에서 소감은 좀 벅차네요, 가슴이.
이번에 만 18세로 태어나서 처음 투표해보는 건데 학교에서 회장, 부회장 이런 거 뽑을 때 많이 했었는데 그런 거랑은 또 느낌이 다르더라고요. 격차를 줄일 수 있는 다 같이 좀 행복하게 살아갈 수 있는 그런 정치를 해주셨으면 좋겠다고 생각해요.
Well, that is our special coverage on the election in South Korea. I'm Moon Gun-young. Thank you for staying with us. Good night.